Bạn có bao giờ đặt ra cái câu hỏi rằng là việc cardio có làm mất cơ hay không? Và trong quá trình của mình tập luyện và mình coaching rất là nhiều khách hàng, hoặc là khi mà mình đào tạo cho các khóa học PT thì mình nhận được câu hỏi này. Và trong video này thì mình sẽ cho mọi người xem một cái đoạn phỏng vấn nho nhỏ giữa mình cùng với lại tiến sĩ Eric Helms mà mình rất là vinh dự mình được gặp trong cái sự kiện là The Ultimate Evidence-Based Conference 2022 tại JBS Health and Fitness. Và mình hỏi Eric 2 câu hỏi là cái khái niệm Concurrent Training, đó chính là khi mà chúng ta tập luyện kháng lực và tập luyện Endurance Training là tập luyện về sức bền thì nó sẽ có ảnh hưởng như thế nào. Và thứ hai là khi mà chúng ta có mục đích về tăng cơ thì chúng ta có thể chọn cái loại hình cardio như thế nào cho nó phù hợp. Ok, xin mời. Alright, hi Eric. I'm gonna ask you about concurrent training because I usually listen to your podcast before with Dr. Swole, and it's such a very nice podcast. And so my question is that, what do you think about if you are doing a hypertrophy program and you also want to improve your cardiovascular respiratory fitness? You think that a guy should eliminate cardio completely from that program, or he can do cardio but still can try to stay away from the interference effect? So what do you suggest about that?
Great question. Yeah. So it's very common that people are going to have the desire to do some cardio and also weight train. And this is a common concern is, what about the interference effect? Is that going to lower my gains? Is that going to cause issues? And when we first had studies on the interference effect, these foundational studies by Hickson in the 80s, what they did was they created a really large cardiovascular stress. They had a hard cardiovascular training program, and they did it immediately before resistance training. So if you just think about that, if I asked you to run like repeated 400-meter sprints and then do a leg day, you know that it would negatively impact your training. So the fact that we found that, and then we looked at the mechanisms over the next few decades, it does establish that, yes, you can have the interference effect. And there's both the molecular interference effect and then the practical effect. This could just be simply that, like I said, I asked you to do hard training of any type right before I asked you to do hard training of resistance training. The molecular effect is the idea that there are divergent adaptations.
Right.
So for cardiovascular endurance, it's not just the heart that is and the lungs that are adapting, but you also see different energy systems which exist in our muscle cells.
Absolutely.
Right? So you can make the argument that when you look at some of these studies that we're asking our body to do two things that are a little bit, they diverge. So there's an interference effect potentially. But as the decades of research have gone on and on and on and on, we've come to find that when you do certain things, you can completely eliminate the interference effect pretty easily.
Wow.
Yeah, so the most recent meta-analysis actually didn't find an interference effect for hypertrophy. And the effect for strength was really small. And the only time it's consistently shown is for power, which actually makes sense because your type 2 fibers, they can, hypertrophy to a similar degree as type 1 fibers. They do produce force, but they contract faster.
Yep.
And they do produce higher shortening velocities or power production in terms of the actual biomechanics. So I think for someone who's, let's say a weightlifter or a shot putter, it's a slightly different question than for someone who's a bodybuilder. But fortunately, for those interested in hypertrophy, the interference effect is the smallest thing we need to worry about. And over the years, we have multiple studies which can help us understand, okay, how do I mitigate interference effects? So for one, simply shifting it from doing it before your resistance training to afterwards reduces the effect.
Easy.
So that's one. Even better though, however, is to have a larger separation. So we're kind of going down like worst to best options for mitigating the interference effect. Doing it before training, that's the worst thing you want to do. Doing your cardio, then doing resistance training, not ideal. Flopping it, a little bit better. Separating it by 4 to 6 hours, a little bit better. Finally, doing them on completely separate days, that has a very large effect on reducing the interference effect. So to get to your point about cardiovascular health, the people who want to improve their health, who are already resistance training, they're almost already probably meeting the activity guidelines. Right? So it takes very little for them to have some additional benefits from cardiovascular training, which there are. So they probably don't need to worry about training on the same day. So most people, they're training probably, 3 to 6 days of resistance training? If that's the case, you can simply program on the other, say, 1 to 3 days, you can do your cardiovascular training on those days. It typically only becomes a problem when you're having someone who's training very hard on, say, 4, 5, or 6 days. And they also have a pretty ambitious cardiovascular goal rather than just general health. So if you're someone who's like, say, competing in CrossFit, and you're actually trying to increase cardiovascular endurance, not just cardiovascular health, and you're trying to become as powerful and explosive as possible, that's when you really want to start leveraging these strategies and thinking about like programming your training around it. And you might go through blocks where you're focused a little more on endurance training, a little more on resistance training, and then when you're doing both, you want to separate them as much as you can when you can, where you might do 2-a-days.
Yeah.
So ideally, like I said, primary strategy on different days, secondary strategy in a 2-a-day format, probably doing your your cardiovascular training first thing in the morning, or and then resistance training in the afternoon or evening. And then if you can't even do that, like if you can't get to the gym twice, I understand that constraint, then just make sure that your cardiovascular training comes after your resistance training.
Awesome answer. In the past, I heard some guys say that doing running will cause more muscle damage compared to cycling. So what is the thing about it?
Yeah, there is also the effect of the modality of the endurance training, which I'm glad you brought up. There are some analyses, and one of the earlier meta-analyses we had by Wilson in 2011 or 12, I can't remember when it was published, did find a lesser interference effect using cycling than running. And if we think about the comparison of these two modalities, like what is the differences? For one, there's impact when you're running. So it's not necessarily just muscle damage, but also the fact that you're creating impact. When you're doing cycling, that's mostly concentric action. You know, so for those who aren't aware, eccentric, the lowering phase of a lift, that tends to be associated with more muscle damage, right? So we talked about the molecular effects and the practical effects. Manipulating the modality, even if you don't change, say, the heart rate zone you're training in or the frequency or the volume of cardiovascular training, can reduce some of that practical element. So if you can do like the elliptical, or if you can do, say, swimming, or if you can do cycling, you can reduce the muscle damage and you can reduce the impact so that you don't have to worry about it as much. So if someone is wanting to do cardiovascular training for general health and the modality is not that important to them, that's a great option. However, if they need to do a specific modality because they want to have, let's say they want to run a 10K, ultimately they've just got to accept that limitation. Or if they just really hate the elliptical or being on a treadmill or being in the gym and they want to go out in nature, that's another limitation you have to accept. But maybe you can bicycle out in nature. So I think that is also something, again, you have to put it in context. Until you're doing a pretty large volume of cardiovascular training, until you're actually going, well, I have to train on the same day because I want to do more than 2 to 3 sessions of cardiovascular training a week, that's when you might have to make some of these concessions and you think about, okay, well, if I'm going to do cardiovascular training on the same day, that's probably the day I should do cycling, right? So that's another way to do it. Let's say you want to go on a run. Let's say you're a triathlete. You're going to go swimming, you're going to do biking, and you're going to do a run, and you've got 4 total workouts per week. So if you are in that situation where you're also resistance training 4 days a week, there's no way to have it so you can separate them. So the 2 modalities that you would probably do on the same day as resistance training would either be swimming or cycling, but not running. So that's a potential application.
Awesome. Thank you for today. Nice
No worries,
to meet
man.
you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for attending, man.
Và chúng ta có thể kết luận được là cái việc tập cardio nó sẽ không làm mất cơ. Và ngoài ra thì mình có đọc thêm được một cái thuyết là cái việc tập cardio, tập về sức bền thì nó sẽ giúp cải thiện được cái mật độ mao mạch. Và từ đó thì cái việc vận chuyển chất dinh dưỡng cho đến cơ bắp và các quá trình như là tổng hợp protein nó sẽ được diễn ra một cách tối ưu hơn. Và từ đó thì cái việc tăng cơ nó sẽ tốt hơn khi so với lại một người mà không có tập cardio. Và khi mà chúng ta thiết kế một cái chương trình tập vừa có kháng lực và vừa có cardio thì chúng ta sẽ có 3 cái lưu ý như sau. Là đầu tiên là chúng ta có thể là cho người đó tập kháng lực, tập gym đầu buổi, sau đó là cardio cuối buổi. Thứ hai là các bạn có thể chia ra 2 session khác nhau trong một ngày và cách nhau ít nhất là 4 cho đến 6 tiếng. Ví dụ như là buổi sáng thì chúng ta có thể là đạp xe hoặc là chạy bộ khoảng từ 30 cho đến 60 phút. Và buổi tối thì chúng ta sẽ tập gym như bình thường. Và thứ ba là chúng ta có thể là tập chia ra những ngày hoàn toàn khác nhau. Ví dụ như là bạn tập một cái chương trình tập luyện như upper lower, sau đó ở những ngày nghỉ, những ngày rest day thì bạn có thể là dành ra từ 60 cho đến 90 phút bạn có thể dành ra để đạp xe để cải thiện sức khỏe về tim mạch. Và cuối cùng là loại hình cardio mà mình hỏi Eric ở câu hỏi thứ hai. Eric khuyên là để hạn chế được cái hiệu ứng interference effect là hiệu ứng can thiệp, chúng ta có thể là tập luyện với xe đạp, hoặc chúng ta bơi lội, hoặc là chúng ta tập cái máy elliptical ở trong phòng gym. Thì như vậy là nó sẽ hạn chế nhất được cái ảnh hưởng về tổn thương cơ bắp là cái muscle damage. Và cuối cùng là theo mình thì bạn hãy nên dành ra từ 3 cho đến 5 tiếng mỗi tuần để cardio, để giúp cải thiện được sức khỏe của tim mạch cũng như là cải thiện được cái khả năng tăng trưởng cơ bắp. Ok, cảm ơn mọi người đã theo dõi. Peace.